Well, welcome to Wealth Strategies Unleashed with Concenture Wealth Management. I'm Robert Gilliland.
And I'm Mike Alexander.
Thank you all for joining us. Please do us a favor, hit that like and subscribe button. You know, Mike, one of the things that I think we should talk about today is we're going through life, everything's great, and pow!
Something
unexpected happens. You know, how do you prepare specifically for your financial well-being when something happens, right? You lose your job, medical emergency, someone passes away. Now all of a sudden you need new air conditioning unit.
Right.
And the cars went out. And the car tires blew out. People need to know, how do we prepare so that we don't miss a beat and we can still reach our goals?
Yeah, you know what? It's a great question, and I think it's really the first place that I think any investor wants to begin in terms of creating a plan, and that is, well, first of all, identify what is it that would really, kind of take the legs out from underneath my stool. What would it take? What would it cause? What type of activity would actually have to happen for that to occur? I think the first thing that you want to do once you've identified those things is set up an emergency fund to make sure that you've got those issues addressed. And I think that can be a number that's different for one person than it is for another, or different for one family than it is for another. But I think this idea of having that 6 to 12 months worth of emergency savings, so that you don't have to, for example, sell an investment that where either one, you've got the money is kind of tied up, if you will, or two, you're in a down market and you don't want to sell low. So having that cushion, if you will, out there really makes for a much better situation in terms of operating through one of those.
I'm amazed. A lot of times we sit down and we talk with people about their emergency funds, and the thing that I'm amazed, what I tell people with regard to emergency funds is that you need to have that 6 to 12 months worth of emergency fund, and whether it's 6 or whether it's 12 or plus or minus either one of those, really all depends on a couple things. Number one, if you're still working, it all depends on job security.
Absolutely.
Right? So if you have job security, then maybe it could be a little bit less. If you don't have job security, maybe it needs to be a little bit more. And I think that number kind of ebbs and flows. I think that the other thing, in order to prepare for job loss or one of these things, is being able to understand what sort of expenses are optional. Right? Going out to eat 7 nights a week is probably something that you can cut out a little bit, right? And so where we found, specifically like with regard to market downturns, people were successful that were able to trim their lifestyle a little bit in order to be able to continue to receive that income, that retirement income that they had planned on. They were actually able to cut it in those tough times with like a market downturn or something like that. But that having an emergency fund is really the cornerstone inside that.
Yeah, I think you just brought up a good point, just as it relates to kind of discretionary versus non-discretionary.
That's what I was looking
spending, if you will, and that really comes down to budgeting. And there are certain things, whether you have a mortgage or you have car payments or you have tuition payments or you have other things that are really not negotiable, if you will, when it comes to planning. And then there's other things, like you said, that, the going out to eat or the vacation or, some of these things that, they're not what we would call the have-tos, or they're the want-tos. And having a good understanding of how much is being spent on either one of those. The whole idea being to create some level of flexibility should you need to do that. One other thing, and I think you probably have had a lot of experience just in the years you've been doing this as well, and that really comes down to health. If I was coming into a situation and I was trying to be prepared for some sort of health emergency, it's pretty good to know, like, where am I right now? That's not to say you can't have something that's unforeseen, but the cost of healthcare and what part of that you're responsible for would be a big one as well. I'm sure.
And I think really where that kind of goes is not just health, but, and this is the most boring subject to me in the entire world, but going through and evaluating your insurance and your insurance policies, right? So understanding, do you have, for an example, on your home, do you have replacement insurance, or do you have a value inside? I forget what's it, replacement or a certain dollar amount that's inside there. Because if you've lived in your house for a long time, the replacement value's probably gone up if you haven't reviewed that homeowner's policy. Evaluate your life insurance policies. Is that enough money in the event of the unforeseen happened and you had a premature death? Is that enough money to help your spouse or reach the goals that you want to have reached?
Right. I'll tell you just an anecdotal story. Obviously, in the Dallas area where I'm located, we went through this period where we had just numerous hailstorms. It seemed like every single week there was a hailstorm. Well, a lot of people didn't realize that the cost of insurance is almost doubled when it comes to homes, cars, and whatnot. And one of the things that typically happens with houses or homes here in Texas is that your deductible may be 1% to 2% the value of the home. And it's remarkable, there's a lot of times when people are like, wait a minute, I own a $500,000 house or I own $1 million house, and I don't just have 20 grand laying around that I can get access to. And so it's amazing how quickly you can deplete an emergency fund. So I think keeping an eye on that, as well as, to your point, understanding insurance and what that means. And I get it. Nobody really wants to spend a lot of time analyzing those types of things until you actually have something happen, and then you think to yourself, wow, I really need to go back and revisit this and think about whether or not I've got adequate coverage.
And, I think in going through and looking at this safety net, going back to the emergency fund, it's so easy to think that you can go and dip in it, right? It's not easy to build that up. If you are spending $5,000 a month, you need to have anywhere between $30,000 and $60,000 sitting there. Now, that doesn't mean it's not working for you. You can have it in high interest bearing accounts and CDs, but you want no risk with it. But to think, I've got this $60,000 sitting over there, I'm just going to go on this vacation, or I'm just going to do this. You got to respect that emergency fund and what it's there for and why it's for that emergency.
Absolutely. We should spend some time talking about the one that I think we've run into quite a bit over the last 30 years that we've been doing this, and that is,
I haven't been doing this for 30 years, old man.
Well, I'm older than most, but I will say that the big one that I know you've at least encountered, and that is when you go through these periods of market downturns. So whether it's something that's maybe more shorter term, or it'd be periods like 2000 to 2002 when we had the Y2K tech meltdown, if you will, that took 10 years for a lot of investors to recover, or great financial crisis, or COVID, or whatever the case is. And so I think market downturns are really the big one. And I think the other thing is that a lot of times they can tend to come with very little warning. And so I think it would be appropriate for us to spend a little bit of time talking about those. Your thoughts?
I think that's spot on. Because when you go through, we spend a lot of time helping people with retirement planning, income planning. What do you do? And I think really your strategy for how you go through to create that income affords you the luxury of maintaining a long-term perspective when you are talking about investing and what happens when that market downturn happens. And I noticed this when the tech bubble popped. Our clients that were able to make it through that were either in retirement or very, very close, they had two things Number one, they had enough cash to make it through there, meaning that whether it was in retirement accounts, whatever, to meet their income needs through distributions or whatever, they had enough cash. The other is that they understood what their discretionary expenses were, and they were able to trim them. I'll never forget, one of my clients called and said, I've cut out my magazine subscriptions, I've stopped this, you can reduce our distribution to this.
Right.
And I'm like, okay, but we don't have a problem. Like, I'll feel more comfortable. By the time we got through that they ended up with more money than where they started, because they were able to be disciplined and didn't have to sell. You go through and you think about, the same was true during the Great Recession. Now, the COVID one, that was the shortest one of all time.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But the reality is that if you plan appropriately for what can go wrong, and it's all about cash flow.
Right.
And you have enough set aside for those emergencies, what that does is that actually makes your life a lot easier. Right? That means that you don't have to worry about the day-to-day movement, because the last thing that you want to do is when in 2009, when the S&P 500 is at 667, you're getting out of everything.
Right.
Because that's what started this next run.
Yeah, I think, as we always say, in our industry, nobody ever wants to be a forced seller, where, you're the person who's actually having to put things on the block, because there's always a buyer on the other side of every one of those transactions. And so I think, to your point, just having the flexibility and the ability to hang on through some times that sometimes can be a little bit difficult allows you to earn it back on the other side. I think, this whole concept around being diversified, I think you hear about people building wealth a lot of times through concentration, whether it's concentration in their business or concentration in a single stock. But the way that you typically protect assets is through diversification. It's also where you start generating some of that cash flow, and paying attention to risk helps protect a lot of that. And if you're doing that along the way, then you can help minimize some of those what we would call unforeseen consequences or unforeseen events that happen out there. Because one of the things that I think we both know, from our careers is, markets are going to go up and they're going to go down. The long-term trend has always been up. I hope it stays that way, but I think it helps to be prepared for those periods when it is down, and to not have to be, again, one of those forced sellers.
I think that something else in preparing for those things that we don't know are going to happen is, while times are good, getting really, really clear on what your liabilities are, knowing where do you have control. A lot of times when the economy's roaring and things look good, and over here in this account it's going up, you see people go and buy houses, take on more debt. Maybe they go buy a car, they take on more debt. They end up increasing the amount of debt because, quite frankly, they're earning more money than what they thought they ever would, and their portfolios are larger than what they ever thought. But it's during these good times that evaluating and reducing your debt so that you have more flexibility makes a tremendous amount of sense, right? So if you're going through and times are good and you've gotten so that you don't have a whole bunch of wiggle room, for example, on your credit card.
Mm-hmm.
Now all of a sudden that black swan event happened or something bad happened. Now you need a lot more than you have available. You potentially could end up doing a lot of damage. Controlling in good times what you owe is vitally important to be able to help plan for these unexpected circumstances. Look, let's face it. You talk about black swan events, right? Black swan events, by definition, are not things you're supposed to see all the time.
Right.
But if you think about it, we've kind of had these kind of black swan events just in this century happen 2, maybe 3 times. If you think about it, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, that was a black swan event. That was something that, from a financial standpoint, you couldn't have planned for in 1 week, 1 million people losing their jobs. It wasn't even conceivable.
Right.
Then you have the financial crisis. Now, if we would have known that the financial crisis was going to happen when it would have happened, we probably wouldn't be doing this podcast. Or if we were doing it from the beach.
Right.
Right. But it seemed like when times were good, they're going to continue to be good. And so you can't always plan for those black swan events, and they don't happen very often, but they have happened. The tech bubble, 9/11, the Great Recession, the pandemic, COVID coming out. We can't really plan for those, but we have to be prepared. So making sure that you are there's no way we can actually conceive what the next black swan event's going to be.
So what you're saying is that like pulling out the water hose is, to put out the fire is a little late after the house is already burned down. Is that what you're telling me? I think you're 100% spot on that, Robert. I think again, you try to prepare when things are really good. I think if you try to prepare when things are tough, it's probably a little late to prepare.
Right.
And I'll share with you kind of a funny story talking about doing things when things are really good. When I was quite young, maybe high school, college age, I can remember my father worked in the energy business, and I kid you not, this is back in the day when the oil business was going really, really well, and this is maybe late 70s, early 80s. It wouldn't be uncommon for like everyone had a new Cadillac. Cadillacs were really big back then. They also had a Rolex watch as well. And then when around 1983, 84, when all of that happened, you could go to any pawn shop that you wanted and find a Rolex watch. So, just this whole idea of when things are good, they're really good, and when things are tough, they're tough, and they're tough all around. So I think what you're saying about being prepared and preparing when things are good, I think helps you navigate when things are really tough.
Yeah, and I think a point that I'm trying to make is that's spot on. One thing, I don't think that either one of us are saying that the unexpected is about. We're not expecting the unexpected right here, right now. Does that make sense?
Are we ever expecting the unexpected? No.
But what I think is that where it's difficult, because it requires discipline, is going through and evaluating those insurance policies, going through and evaluating your discretionary expenses, going through and evaluating the need and how much you have in an emergency fund, going through and looking at your credit and your accessible credit, and having a plan so that becomes lower. Going through and the whole thing about preparing for the unexpected is giving you choices. Having choices gives you freedom. When you have that freedom, you end up with more happiness, right? And so there's Jocko Willink has this great saying that says, discipline equals freedom. I'm a big believer in discipline equaling freedom. Going back to the story of that client in the tech bubble popping, the reason why they have the freedom was because they had the discipline, and with more freedom comes more happiness. And I think that's really the whole point that we're trying to make about how to prepare for the unexpected, is to do it while it's good, have discipline while times are good, so that when that thing that we don't know is coming around the corner comes around, we're in great shape.
So, Robert, if I hear you correctly, and I'm kind of just thinking about it, markets are pretty good. They're at or pretty close to all-time highs, right? Economy seems to be cooking along at a fairly reasonable pace. Unemployment really, really low. Housing prices really, really high. As we mentioned, asset prices are pretty high. So when's a good time to start thinking about that?
Well,
times are pretty good, right? Isn't this when we should be planning, right?
I think that's the point. I think that's the point, and the reason why we're doing this podcast is right now is the time to go in and evaluate all that. You don't want to be evaluating it when the markets are down. You would agree 100% that the time to sell is not when the market has dropped 30%, right? When everyone else is giving up, that's not the time for you necessarily to get out of it. So having flexibility, having freedom to make those choices while times are good. I am not advocating going through, and I don't think that you are either,
Oh, no.
advocating going through and having wholesale liquidations to do that. But what you do have to do is you have to stress test a portfolio. You have to stress test your plan. Look at what your probabilities are of success. What happens if the markets go down, 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 then up, up, down, 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 down? All the different possible market outcomes. Review your plan. Review your emergency fund. Review all of these things that we've talked about. And then you have that peace of mind. And you know what adjustments and tweaks you maybe need to go through to make so that when that next shoe drops, you're completely covered.
Only under one condition, Robert, and that is that you brought your crystal ball in and you're going to tell me when that next unexpected event is supposed to be.
Yeah, well, that's just it. You don't know, and that's why you got to go through to do it. So, kind of with that, any other parting shots?
That's all I got for you today.
Hey, I want to say thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed this. Thank you for listening to our podcast, and we will see you next Monday.
See you next time.